Hello, I'm John Nicholson. Welcome to my YouTube channel. And I'd just like to say thank you to all of you who send me questions either on Twitter or on Blue Sky or on Facebook, because a few months ago I did a question and answer session. So yesterday I asked you to send me questions again. I thought I'd have another crack at it. Last time round, I think it was something like 30,000 people saw it, and I got a couple of hundred questions. So I thought I would have another go. So thank you for sending me your questions, and I'm just going to work my way through them. I won't be able to answer all the questions, of course, but I'll do my best. A number of people have written to me, given the obsequious approach that Trump has towards Vladimir Putin, and the way in which President Macron this week called out Trump to his face about the lies he was telling about Ukraine. And we know that Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, is heading over to Washington. So I've been asked by Sheila and others about Mr. Starmer and what his approach should be to Trump compared with President Macron. Well, thank you for your question, Sheila and others. I think Keir Starmer has got to be firm. I don't think we can pussyfoot around. The American president only understands people who are firm with him. And I thought that President Macron was absolutely correct when he challenged Trump, who'd said that the Americans had given more assistance to Ukraine than the Europeans. That's not true. And the French president told him it wasn't true to his face. Now, it's absolutely clear, and Steve has asked a question about this. Steve says, given the USA is no longer an ally of freedom and democracy, is there any alternative to increase military spending in Europe? Well, thank you for that, Steve. I think it's absolutely clear that we can no longer rely on the United States. You know, just the other day, there was a vote at the United Nations, and it was called by Ukraine. It was a very simple vote. It was to reassert Ukraine's right to independence and self-determination within its existing borders as guaranteed by international treaty. You'd think every country would support that. But when the vote was called, the liberal democracies around the world, from Estonia to Australia, all backed the Ukrainians. And then in a roll call of shame, Russia, Belarus, North Korea were joined for the very first time by the United States. My goodness, FDR would be rolling in his grave. So it's clear that we can't rely on the United States anymore. And I've said this before, I think the Europeans must take responsibility for our own defence and our own security. So yes, Steve, I think we should see increased military spending in all the European countries. I think that we should stop funding Trident, which is an enormous waste of money, and instead be spending our money on building up our military so we can defend ourselves in the North Sea and elsewhere, and so that we can continue to give the support that we're giving and increase support to Ukraine, because Vladimir Putin must not be rewarded for his aggression. Otherwise, the world order, as we know it, collapses, and China will be emboldened. It will think it will be free to attack Taiwan. And of course, Putin will set his sights perhaps on the Baltic states. So of course, we must stand against the Americans and the Russians, the North Koreans and the other rogue states as they now are. A number of questions have come in about Trump's transphobia, because he said that there was only two sexes, only two genders, however you wish to describe it. And of course, we know that it's much more fluid than that. But he's insisting that people who've had sex change operations should go by their birth assignment. And that means that people who look like men, who've got hairy chests, who've got beards, in Trump's world, should be forced to use changing rooms with women because they were born as women. I mean, it's grotesque. And there has been a culture war about this for some considerable time. And, you know, ghastly groups like the LGBT Alliance for example, here in the United Kingdom and others around the world, have been pushing transphobia now for a couple of years. I'm absolutely clear. I'm a trans ally. I believe that trans rights are human rights. And I think if we allow Trump and others to attack trans people with impunity, they're going to come for gay people like me afterwards. So I think trans rights are enormously important, and I'm very depressed at the way Labour politicians who used to stand up for LGBT rights have backed down and backed away from it. And I'm a strong supporter of the GRA bill in Scotland, which was kiboshed by the Westminster government. On a related issue, I was asked, do you think attitudes at the BBC have changed re-LGBT issues since you were there? Well, thank you for that question. It's an interesting one. I became the first ever BBC One presenter to come out as gay in the 1990s. I was in I think I was 35, 36 or thereabouts. And I didn't really have much choice, because if you do a high profile programme like I did on BBC One, people ask you about your private life. You get asked if you got a wife or a girlfriend. Journalists ask you about this. People write in and ask you questions about this. And it's difficult just to say it's none of your business, which I suppose some people think would be the obvious answer. It's difficult. If you have a public position, people notice you in the street. So do you then never hold hands with your boyfriend? I mean, how far do you take this? So I decided I would control the agenda. And I gave an interview, and I was asked if I was in a relationship, and I said with a man. And it ran as a big story. It was all over the place. It was pages and pages in the Daily Mail, I think it was, and in all the other tabloids. And it wasn't good for my career. My BBC bosses were furious about it. That's another story which I might tell at some point. It certainly scared other people off coming out as gay on television for a number of years. I know some now have, but I'm not convinced that attitudes at the BBC are as liberal as they should be. But of course, gay people are now protected by law, which when I came out, we weren't. You could sack somebody simply for being gay, and the law changed, and you can't do that anymore. So there is protection. But you don't see a lot of gay people in high profile positions in broadcasting, certainly who choose to talk about their private life. So I think we have some significant way to travel on that. Lots of other questions across lots of different subjects. Lots of people writing from Scotland. Joey asks me, since we're talking about the BBC, about whether I think there's an anti-SNP bias by the BBC. Well, I know a lot of people in Scotland think that. And I certainly think it's true that when you watch network programmes, there aren't enough Scottish or SNP voices. I mean, my goodness, Nigel Farage is never off Question Time. And the question is that the BBC reflecting public opinion, or is that the BBC creating public opinion? I know that I got asked to do a lot of stuff by the BBC when I was an MP, but it was always about Scotland. You know, I would do Politics Live, which is on every day on BBC One or BBC Two, I can't remember, about lunchtime. And they would only ever have me in to talk about Scottish issues, whereas MPs from other countries in these islands would talk about America or, you know, European Union affairs or a host of different things. But with me, it was only ever about Scotland. And I said to the presenter once, you know, I went to university in America. I could talk about other stuff, but no, it's only ever Scottish stuff. So I think the BBC has a very Anglocentric attitude. I would have to say that my experience of talking to individual BBC journalists in Scotland might surprise a lot of people, because a lot of folk that I know SNP supporters and other nationalists believe to be hardline unionists are privately supporters of independence. So don't always take on face value what you hear online about the private politics of individual presenters and reporters, because often what the online public believe to be true isn't. George and Elaine say, should the SNP continue sending MPs to Westminster? Well, the answer to that is yes. As long as we're in the United Kingdom, I think that we should continue to contribute our parliamentarians from Scotland to Westminster. I know that Sinn Féin, for example, in Ireland don't do this, and they have an abstentionist policy, but I haven't come across many people in Scotland, whether supporters of independence or opponents, who believe that we should, after a general election, not participate at Westminster. And there's lots of good that we can do for our constituents. You know, we can ask questions of ministers, try and embarrass ministers if they're behaving badly. We're doing that at the moment over Grangemouth, for example. There's lots of things that our MPs can do. I mean, it might be that in the future, the Scottish voting public takes a different attitude towards that. But at the moment, they don't. And so I think Scottish voters expect us, when elected, to go down to Westminster and to take part in the business of Westminster. Liam, Douglas, and a variety of other people say to me, will Scotland be independent in my lifetime? Well, the answer to that is yes. I've been a supporter of Scottish independence since I was a preteen, and my mum and dad were not initially. They were both unionists. But I never understood why Scotland should not be independent. It seemed to me that we would be a very effective small country, and I've always thought that. We're similar size to Denmark, with oil riches comparable with Norway, which tragically we gave away. I would like to see Scotland as an independent country in the European Union, with a strong, progressive, liberal identity on the Nordic model. That's what I want to see. Always been opposed to Brexit. And you know, the trajectory has changed dramatically in my lifetime. People who supported independence were once part of a fringe group, really, when I was a kid. And now more than 50% of people support independence. And if you look at the age demographic, the only group who oppose Scottish independence are the over 65s. And amongst young people, support for independence is very strong. Now, so far, Westminster is saying no, but we're meant to be in a voluntary union. We're not a colony, we're told by all the political leaders at Westminster. So if we're not a colony, but in a voluntary union, we have the right to leave. And so the question I always ask political leaders at Westminster is, what's the process to leave? Surely if our Parliament at Holyrood votes in favour of holding a referendum, then in a democracy, we have the right to hold that referendum. Now, I have no problem with people campaigning against Scottish independence. Of course, in a democracy, they're perfectly entitled to. But what nobody is entitled to do is to stop the Scots from choosing our future through a referendum. That is our right in a democracy, and it's outrageous to try and stop it. So I do think we will become independent. Ali asked whether I knew about the group sex sessions, which Nadine Dorries alleges took place at Westminster, detailed in her Bodice Ripper book. Well, Ali, my first reaction to that is dry boke, as we say north of the border. I'm glad I'm not having my tea anytime soon. Have you seen most Westminster MPs? The thought of it is enough to turn your stomach. No, I knew nothing whatsoever about group sex sessions. I'd have to say I'd take pretty much anything that Nadine Dorries says with an enormous pinch of salt. Anyway, if it did happen, and it was in the offices, seems pretty inappropriate to me. But if she's so offended by it, why didn't she make a fuss at the time and talk to her chief whip and even go public about it? She waited until she was out of politics and wanting to write a book about it. So make of that what you will. What do I miss most about being an MP, if anything, I'm asked? Well, I miss lots of things. I miss my staff a lot. I had a wonderful staff, mostly feisty women, one man, I think. I'd always had one man throughout my time in at Westminster, but mostly women in the constituency. My goodness, they fought hard for people, for constituents, because a lot of the stuff you never get to hear about because it's private. And when people come to see an MP, the MP is often the last port of call for people who are in desperate straits. So I was very proud of my staff who fought so hard for constituents. I really miss them. I miss the select committee where I used to sit in that horseshoe and cross-examine various miscreants and others and ask questions, because MPs cross-party used to cooperate on those, and the civil servants were terrific. You would get really good briefing notes. I would do my own research as well. And you got the chance to affect debate and government policy, which was very useful. I mean, for example, I pushed very hard for BBC presenters' salaries to be published. The government picked up on that, and then the BBC had to do it. And as I suspected, what we discovered was there was a huge gender pay gap. And there was a great deal of outrage about that, because for decades, forever, the BBC had been paying its women less than its men. And there was also a big shortage of black and minority ethnic people in the top pay brackets. So that caused a beneficial change, which I was very proud of. There's a host of different things as an MP I was proud of. I was very proud of introducing my touring bill at Westminster, where I called for gay men who are found guilty of crimes which are no longer on the statute book to be given a pardon. Now, initially, Conservative government and Michael Gove, who was the Justice Secretary, said that they would support this. But then Michael Gove got the sack, and the Tories did a reverse somersault on their promise to me, and they filibustered and talked the bill out. They broke their promise to me. And I was very sad about that, but I was very, very pleased because the Scottish Government picked up the bill immediately and passed it with all party support in Scotland. So all the people who had those criminal convictions have had them expunged in Scotland. It's symbolic, but important. Whereas down in England, that hasn't happened. And that has practical issues for gay men. For example, when there was an unequal age of consent, a 21-year-old who had a 20-year-old boyfriend were caught by the police, and the 21-year-old had a criminal conviction for paedophilia, for underage sex, with a 20-year-old who might have only been a few weeks younger than he himself was. That means he's never been able to become a teacher, he's never been able to travel to America. It's had a real knock-on effect on many men's lives, and I wanted justice for them. I succeeded in Scotland, but not in England. I don't miss many of the political players at Westminster at all. I thought that the standard of debate was often puerile. The Speaker, Speaker Hoyle, I don't miss his screaming, puce-coloured face as he bawled at people. I thought his behaviour was often deeply immature and affected the whole standard of behaviour at Westminster. So there's lots of things I don't miss. I miss my constituents. I used to have a great time just wandering through the constituency, talking to people. I tried to be approachable. I tried to answer people's questions, and I do miss that. Keith, Mike, Linda and others say they miss me on committees. Well, thank you very much for that. Francis says you're sadly missed as an MP. Thank you for that. Carol says, I hope you re-enter politics. Meanwhile, LBC Radio should snap you up. Well, it's funny you should say that. I did a screen test for LBC, went very well, I think, and they haven't answered my calls since. So who knows? But I would certainly like to get back on the radio. I used to enjoy the radio. Craig says, should independent supporting parties come together instead of the clan mentality. Well, thank you for that, Craig. I suppose by that you mean the Greens, the Alapa Party and the SNP, all of whom support independence. I think having a separate Green Party is a good thing. I think the Greens have often advanced progressive policies. I'm not a Green voter, I'm an SNP voter, but I voted Green south of the border. I voted Labour south of the border in the past as well. But I think it's good to have separate parties, the SNP and the Greens, and I think that has worked well, and they've cooperated often, as we know. They've had a little argument recently, which seems to have been mostly resolved under the current First Minister, which I'm glad to see. The Alapa Party is different. The Alapa Party is a tiny party founded by Alex Salmond. It's on, 1% or something in the polls at the moment. They've never won a seat in the councils or the Scottish Parliament or the Westminster Parliament. And they pursued a very nasty, socially conservative agenda, obsessing about trans people, for example, and I've no time for that. I think when especially young Scots think about their future, what they want to see is a liberal, progressive, Nordic model Scotland. And the angry social conservatism, which is espoused by the Alapa Party, I think is very unattractive for voters, especially young voters. And we know that because they never win elections. So I don't want to see them re-merge in any way with the SNP. I don't like what they stand for. I don't like the way they conduct themselves. I think their leadership tends to be pretty unpleasant in its private debating style and its public debating style. In any case, the party is falling apart. I mean, they're fighting like cats in a sack, and I suspect they'll disappear. Martin says, what is the stupidest tradition on the parliamentary estate? Well, there are so many, Martin. I can't even begin to know. Let me see. I remember when we first arrived, we didn't have an office, we didn't have a telephone, but we had a sword hook. Now that's ludicrous. We had a wee ribbon with us to hang our swords. I mean, I'm all for good traditions, if it doesn't interfere in the workplace, but I've never had a sword. I don't know anyone who has a sword. I'm certainly not going to be hanging my sword up on a sword hook. And those kind of things are silly. I think it's silly the way people refer to the honourable and right honourable gentlemen. Many of them are not remotely honourable, let alone right honourable. I think a lot of that stuff is nonsense. I think the way in which you can't accuse somebody of telling a lie when they clearly are is nonsensical. I mean, Boris Johnson, the biggest liar in post-war politics, couldn't be called a liar in the House of Commons, even when he was caught lying. That is silly. I mean, that is stupid. I'm off again for treating people with courtesy, but sometimes you have to be able to call a spade, and I thought that was a completely ridiculous rule as well. Ian asked me an interesting question about sports washing in the light of Trump's praise for Mohammed bin Salman, who is the effective ruler in Saudi Arabia. Now, as you may remember, he ordered the brutal murder of a Saudi journalist, Mr. Khashoggi. He was cut up and dismembered, lured to a Saudi embassy, and then murdered. And the world was shocked, and people like Biden initially refused to shake his hand, and but as the months and years have passed, he's wheedled his way back into the international community, because of course Saudi Arabia is wealthy, and that cash talks. But one particularly invidious thing he's doing is sports washing. That is trying to improve his reputation and the reputation of his country by buying football clubs, for example, because people will then associate something healthy, something fun with him and Saudi Arabia. A particularly grotesque example of that was Newcastle. Newcastle, which had been having a terrible time with its previous owner, and then he bought Newcastle United. And you saw the ludicrous business of Newcastle supporters dancing up and down with tea towels on their heads, purporting to be Saudi headgear. And Mrs. Khashoggi said that she was horrified to watch that because they didn't seem to care at all, these Newcastle United supporters, about who was buying their club and just the wicked things that had been done in his name and by him, including the murder of her husband. And my heart went out to her. And I argued very strongly that we should not allow foreign countries to buy football clubs in this country. I said it to the Secretary of State, argued it in Parliament, argued it at the Select Committee. I don't think we should allow sports washing. I don't think the Saudis should have been allowed to buy Newcastle United. I don't think they should be allowed to buy football clubs in general. And I think that's a reform that is long overdue. So I really appreciate that question. And I know that's an unpopular view, especially in Newcastle, but that's my view. So listen, we've had a wide range of questions. I could have gone on for longer. I've had more questions. If you think this is a useful exercise, please do let me know. Please add your comments, whether you're watching this on Twitter, Blue Sky, or Facebook. And of course, the whole of this is on my YouTube channel. Please carry on subscribing to it. It doesn't cost a penny. Hundreds of new subscribers followed me on YouTube this weekend. I think it's very important we have respectful political discussions and debates. And so I love the fact you're subscribing. I really appreciate it. Thank you for all your kind comments. And please do press subscribe if you're watching on YouTube or on any of the other social media sites. Press subscribe. Please follow my channel and please add your comments underneath and I'll answer them, as many of them as I possibly can. Thank you for watching.